Alright, since I'm running out of time before clinicals and we are running out of time before the test, I'm just going to try to blow through calcium and the ladies and just kind of give a quick overview of what they're about in particular. So, calcium is, I found calcium to be kind of confusing at first because most of the effects of calcium are depressive in nature. Um, he kind of just stands in the doorway and tries to keep sodium from getting inside. He hyperpolarizes the membrane, basically. He hangs out right on the edge of the membrane and makes it less likely to reach threshold, less likely to throw the doors open. And also, when the doors are open, he kind of slows down how fast sodium can get inside the cell and how fast, like an action potential, can propagate across the membrane. And so you would think that all of his effects, like that's pretty straightforward, all of his effects probably should just cause symptoms related to slower and weaker uh, reactions of nerves and muscles, right? But that's not exactly true because if you remember, calcium is also really important for muscle contractions. On the inside of the muscles, the electrolyte that actually causes the power stroke or the myosin fibers to contract is calcium that hooks onto them and causes contraction. So he has slightly paradoxical effects because he basically does two things. He makes the action potential less likely to happen, but at the same time, he has important impact on muscle contraction. So he can actually strengthen muscle contractions in very specific scenarios. So his ability to depress nerve tissue is greater than his ability to increase the power of muscle contractions. And so in most muscle tissue, you still see the depressive effect because most muscle tissue relies on nerve signals to decide when it's going to contract and when it's not going to contract. The obvious thing here is your skeletal muscles because your skeletal muscles obviously only do things when they're voluntary, so they only do things when your nervous system tells them to do things. But this also applies to your bowels because your enteric nervous system, even though you don't have direct control over it, peristalsis and the contractions of your nerves are still controlled by a nervous system. So the depressive effects of calcium, high calcium, on the nervous system are um, greater than the effects that calcium has on the muscle contractions. So anytime you have a muscle tissue that has a high neurological factor to when it goes off, you will see greater depressive effects in that tissue than you will see stimulatory effects from having more calcium around. The greatest place where this becomes of significance is the fact that the heart doesn't really have nervous tissue that directly tells it what to do, when to do it. The effects, all the nervous system effects on the heart are really related to just changing the way that the membrane um, gains or removes electrolytes. It changes the channels, etc., but there's not like the same direct innervation. So if you depress the nervous system, the heart is still kind of doing its thing on its own, and it's still heavily affected by the fact that there's more calcium around. So you actually get, specifically in the heart, you get greater contractility every time the heart beats because there's more calcium around, and so it increases the amount of calcium that floods into the cell and also is released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum anytime that the contractions happen, and so you get greater contractility. So when you have hypercalcemia, you pretty much get depressive symptoms in your neurological function. You can get tingling, you can get paresthesia, you can get um, numbness, etc. But your blood pressure will actually go up because your contractility will go up. Um, this can cause some arrhythmias because when the heart is repolarizing, it obviously get has to move calcium elsewhere, and so um, you can get some arrhythmias related to this. Specifically, I think it's a QT interval, but I kind of know we're going to have to know that. So there you go. When you have all of that going on, you get mostly depressive symptoms, but you get kind of a paradoxical, kind of confusing increase in blood pressure. The depressive symptoms also go to like the bowels. You get constipation because peristalsis is reduced. Because, like I said, your bowels are highly dependent on neurological symptoms or not symptoms, signals in order to contract, and so you get reduced bowel sounds and you get reduced bowel movement, constipation, so on and so forth. On the other end of the spectrum, when your calcium gets low, you pretty much just get the opposite of all of these things. You get excitable nerves, you get excitable bowels, you get um, pretty much all the same effects. You also get a little bit of the reverse because you get reduced contractility. Because, like I said, since the heart is not innervated by nerves as much and it more self regulates whether it's going to beat or not, it is greater affected by calcium levels in the amount of contraction that it does. One of the most important medications that is likely to come up is calcium gluconate. And the reason for that is, especially in situations where you have high potassium, you start getting some sort of arrhythmia from another electrolyte imbalance. Calcium gluconate can be really useful because it stabilizes the membrane and kind of keeps excitability issues from happening. It has these depressive effects. Yes, it can cause its own arrhythmias, but if you already have an arrhythmia from a like hyperkalemia or something like that, this can kind of stabilize the membrane and keep the arrhythmia of the hyperkalemia from worsening. There are certain arrhythmias that are worse than others, and so if you give calcium gluconate, you can kind of protect the heart from reaching like VFib or one of the really problematic arrhythmias. So calcium gluconate is good for that. You'll also give calcium gluconate if you have low calcium because obviously it has calcium in it, and so it basically has the same effect. Calcium is interesting because calcium is actually a really well regulated electrolyte in your system. Similar to sodium, your body has a lot of mechanisms that it uses to control calcium. You've got the parathyroid hormone, you've got calcitonin. There's a lot of ways that your body regulates calcium. And you don't actually run into hypo and hypercalcemia all that often because your body has a great thing to do with calcium. If it has too much or too little calcium, it actually has a really good way to manage that. Probably one of the best ways to manage that of all the electrolytes because it just takes all the calcium and puts it into your bones. And so if it needs more calcium, it pulls it out of the bones. If it needs less calcium, it just puts it into the bones. It's really well set up to manage calcium issues. So if you have, for example, hypercalcemia, the issue can be caused by too many antacids or something to that effect, but really like 90% of problems related to hypercalcemia are going to be caused by an inappropriate amount of parathyroid hormone, and so your body is breaking bones down at a higher rate than it should. If you remember, the osteoclasts are responsible for breaking bone down, and typically they get stimulated by parathyroid hormone and they start breaking bone down to release calcium into the system. Well, if you have typically a parathyroid malignancy, like a tumor or something like that of the parathyroid, then it releases too much parathyroid hormone. The osteoclasts start going crazy. You know, it's demo day. They start, they don't even have a plan anymore. They're just breaking bone down. And so when this function goes up, you tend to get weak bones, and that's not caused by hypercalcemia. It's the cause of hypercalcemia, right? So you would think it seems kind of paradoxical because you would think, well, if I'm hypercalcemic, then shouldn't I have like really strong bones and like my body just doesn't know what to do with them? That's actually not the case because the hypercalcemia is the effect of the breakdown of the bones. And so you actually end up with weak bones. You can get fractures, osteoporosis, etc., bone pain, so on and so forth. And that is all because the destruction of the bones is typically what causes hypercalcemia, and that's a cancerous process. Magnesium really influences the way that her husband or whatever, calcium, works on the body. And so a lot of magnesium's effects are less to do with directly magnesium doing something and more to do with causing either low or high calcium levels or kind of interfering with calcium when calcium is trying to do things. Magnesium is always just trying to mess with calcium a little bit. Um, so, in a case where you have hypermagnesium, you get a lot of calcium or a lot of magnesium blocking these calcium channels on the membrane. And so it really is kind of like um, Agnes is just going a little too hard. She's mad at calcium. Calcium is like kicked out of the cell, and she says, "You're sleeping in the doghouse tonight." She's doing a little too much, and so calcium gets blocked from a lot of the effects that he wants to do, and so the effects of hypermagnesemia are almost entirely depressive, because yes, you get the depressive symptoms of having too much calcium hanging around in front of the gates, but because she's blocking the way in for calcium, she also blocks this musculatory mechanism, and so it's basically just fully depressive. Also, let's put depressive here. There's another major effect of hypermagnesemia in that when your body is trying to determine whether or not it has enough calcium, particularly in the parathyroid, it really can't tell the difference between magnesium and calcium. It kind of just sees a +2 ion go by and says that was a calcium, that was a calcium, that was a calcium. It's like it needs to count black and white sheep, but all it's really doing is counting sheep. And so if you have a bunch of black sheep go by, then it doesn't know that there's not really a whole lot of white sheep. Okay, so when your magnesium levels are really high, it tends to cause hypocalcemia because the the parathyroid glands are depressed by the fact that they can't really tell the difference. And so you start getting a lot of the effects of hypocalcemia. And so there's an important symptom here that I missed, but this is also associated with um, hyper, and that is tetany, spasms, etc. When your calcium gets low, there's less blockade on the cell membrane. The cell becomes slightly depolarized and it gets really excitable. And so you can get tetany from that. And that can happen because the calcium levels are low, or that can happen because the magnesium levels are too high. When you get hypomagnesemia, you end up with some also kind of interesting paradoxical effects from calcium because, for one, now you have less blockade, and so you get calcium can go a little bit harder than usual. But this also tends to coincide with hypocalcemia. So if hypercalcemia happens, you tend to get hypocalcemia. If you have hypomagnesemia, then you also tend to get hypocalcemia because magnesium is really important in the arts and crafts day when it comes time to make vitamin D. And so you get reduced vitamin D activation. There's a really important enzyme that activates vitamin D that allows for the absorption of calcium, and low magnesium basically inhibits that. There's also a receptor on the parathyroid that requires magnesium to function basically, and so if there's not enough magnesium, then it basically can't count sheep at all, and it has really no idea what's going on, and so you also get reduced parathyroid hormone, and so the whole regulation system of calcium just kind of breaks down. When magnesium is out of whack, you get some pretty crazy effects from that. Phosphorus really isn't all that interesting. The only thing that phosphorus doesn't really do a lot on its own. The main effect that phosphorus has on all of these symptoms is that phosphorus is kind of a homewrecker, and calcium really likes to hook up with phosphorus. Um, So the greatest effect that you have from having too much calcium, too much phosphorus, in particular, is that they like to hook up, and when you get calcium phosphate, that's what you have when you have a bone. And so when these two hook up, something will calcify, and one of the most obvious places that will happen is inside the kidneys, because let's say you have too much phosphorus, your body is like, all right, well, we need to get rid of some phosphorus. Let's start chucking it out into the urine. And when you have a whole lot out there, and then a calcium comes by, all of these phosphorus just jump on that calcium like, like they've just been waiting for him at the bar. This is like the opposite effect of a normal bar. There's too many women. A man comes by, and those cougars are getting after it. So you can get kidney stones from having too much phosphorus because they don't match up at an appropriate rate. They get really really interested in any man that comes by. Um, and so too much phosphorus tends to lead to low calcium levels, and so you can get these effects, but it's all related to calcium. Calcium, when you get too much of it, you get basically the same problem. Calcium starts getting eliminated. Your body wants to get rid of the calcium. It says we have too much of it. It starts going out into the urine. And if a phosphorus goes by, man, will it hook up with it. And so, once again, you can end up with kidney stones, and you will end up with really low phosphorus levels because all of that gets kind of bound up and ejected from the system, or hopefully ejected from the system, because if it doesn't, then you've got a very painful kidney stone.